Good morning. We are live this morning with Jonathan Belolo, and we're going to be talking about teens and meaningful relationships that they have not had, should have, and why this is important, and what can happen if they don't have these meaningful relationships. As usual, I want to remind you that we are live on Tuesday morning, 10:30 a.m. So if you're watching us at that time, please feel free to put any questions or comments in the comment section, and Jonathan will address those live on air. If you're watching a replay, thank you for doing that. But Jonathan will not be able to address your questions or comments. But if you have any, put them in the comment section and dialogue with other people who are watching replay. Increasingly, most of our audience does watch them, so you can have a vigorous conversation that way. Jonathan, we want you to tell us about how not having positive relationships with peers and family can affect a child's mental health, and how establishing healthy communication channels can help determine root causes of any issues before they lead to depression or substance abuse or any of the other things that we are trying to avoid. But first, I need you to tell me a little bit about yourself and your work.
All right. So first of all, I want to say thank you for this opportunity as well. I am a licensed clinical social worker that specialized in substance use disorders, and I started off my experience, my clinical journey, with actually working with at-risk youth and teens, and then eventually worked my way up to working with adults with both mental health and substance use disorders. And my main approach when talking about clinical treatment is working with individuals that have had both family dynamic issues, substance use issues, mental health issues, and trying to treat them in a safe and loving environment. I am currently the Vice President of Clinical Services here at GM Miami, and we are a mental health and substance abuse-based clinic here in downtown Miami. And what my primary role is to ensure that all the clinicians underneath me are doing the best job possible in treating each and every one of our patients. That being said, what I wanted to talk about is what it means to have a meaningful relationship, and especially with this new era and this new age, what does that mean looking forward into really our generations as they are today, and what it could be like in the future. But I'd like to get a few things down before we start, is try to hone in on what I'm talking about when I say adolescence, because I do think that it's a little bit of a broad term, and sometimes we throw it out there. And there are different developmental stages when we identify adolescence, and especially on my end, we don't really just start at, everyone's the same. Everybody under the age of 18 is the same. We really try to see what age range the individual is at, because that could mean several different factors, from a biological level, from a cognitive level, and even from a social level. We really see differences between one stage or the other. So I'll start off at like an earlier stage of adolescence, which would usually range from 10 to 13 years old, but could be as early as 8 or 9. And a lot of these factors depend on race, gender, and other factors. But we'll start seeing a lot of, on a biological level, we'll start seeing like, the standard thing that you see in an adolescent. You see a growth spurt, you see skin changes, voice changes, body hair changes, maybe an increase in body fat, or just overall physiological changes that are happening. On a cognitive level, there's definitely a lot more abstract, thinking. There's more of a hypothesis type of behavior of thinking. They're thinking outside of the box. They're really trying to become more of an independent thinker in that sense. And the biggest thing is on the social changes. They're really trying to identify, and maybe there's an increased interest in individuals of the opposite sex. There might be more of that desire for independence. Still not fully there, but it's definitely present. You're starting to maybe feel that little separation that parents like to mention, where it's like, I don't know, my son or daughter is just not wanting to talk to me anymore. And that we usually see that as early as like 10 years old. We start seeing that mom, drop me off a little further away from the school. You're embarrassing me, right? So we
Mhm.
start seeing that, and from a social perspective, and even from a clinical perspective, these behaviors are actually, they're not only advantageous, but they're evolutionarily like required, because one of the things that's happening here on the developmental stages, the adolescent is starting to understand the idea of independence and autonomy. And as much as parents always want to be the caretaker, evolutionarily speaking, they need to have some form of independence and autonomy. So
Mhm.
this is the very fundamental stage at this age where we start wanting to look at, how parents create a healthy relationship, healthy boundaries with their children, and this is usually where we start seeing some challenges, because some parents have a harder time letting go of this idea of a child having a social independence that is not really structured around family and family structured, you know, solely family structure. Because remember, prior to this, if you're looking at anything prior to this age range, it's really 100% codependent on the family, which is natural, and that's generally how it's supposed to be, right? From the earlier stages, from ages, really birth until 10, you're really looking at a child being completely codependent on their parents, and that's
Mhm.
healthy, and that is their primary figure and role model. Um, having these social evolutions towards, having friends and having certain other peer figures that are going to be part of their overall understanding of social interactions is huge. So that's the earlier stage. As we get onto the middle stage, and that's generally speaking from around the ages of like 14 to 16,
Mhm.
we'll start seeing some more distinctive lifestyles, some independent changes. Definitely on a biological level, we're starting to see higher testosterone or estrogen, depending on what. So you're starting to see more of that increased desire towards sexual stimulation and things like that. So that leads to the possible acting out in high school. And, once again, from a biological level, hormones and chemicals are going all over the place, and that's why we like to call this stage the kind of the rebellious stage when it comes to acting out in regards to, sexual behaviors. And then in a cognitive level, this is where you're starting to see a lot more emotional and intellectual capacities. So at this age, you could start seeing the arguments are much more sound or rationalizing, and you'll
Yes.
hear parents are like, I don't even know how to win with them anymore. There's a truth to that, because they're starting to be able at that age range to like have a solid founded argument. It's not just like because I want to. Like they're really starting to give you reasons of why their behavior makes sense. And in
Mhm.
their mind, right, that while we parents want to say, I know better, I know the best, which most of the time is actually not necessarily wrong. They probably do know more based off of life experience and things like that. The child is having, or the adolescent is having a lot of internal dialogues at this stage where they're intellectualizing a lot more. They have a higher capacity for emotional rationalization, and that's why you start seeing them shift over to, well, now I actually, can do some hypothesis on my thoughts. I'm testing it a little bit, and
Mhm.
their goal obviously is for more autonomy, and that's every adolescent's goal is autonomous functioning. So I'm just trying to be independent and try to figure out how to do this on my own. And from a social level, they're really looking for peer relationships, and they're more likely to give a higher and greater significance in their peer relationships over their family relationships at this stage. And that once again is normal because of what we're about to talk about in the later stage, which is the 17 to 21-year-old. Which at this stage you're generally more physically mature. You've from a biological level, you've gone through your major roles of development, but at this point you're kind of trying to identify from a cognitive level your self identity, and trying to bolster your self esteem, trying to feel good about yourself and your decisions that you've been making, and
Mhm.
and at this stage you also have full blown adult cognitive functioning. So right, so you're thinking like an adult, maybe not behaving like one, but you're at least thought process is there. Like you're being able to go head to head with another adult, and you'll see a lot of people in this age range. They'll be able to hold on their own conversations with an adult without really much difficulty, and that's where you'll see the last stage, which is on a social level. There's much more of that planning for the future, talking about jobs, talking about college, talking about what am I going to do? Maybe establishing some long-term relationship goals. You're seeing more that serious dating versus just hanging out with friends, and right, these are all looking from a future planning perspective, and that's more in the later stage of adolescence. So I wanted to get that down, because when somebody comes to me and asks me, first question I ask is how old, because the age will make a very big difference in how we treat them and what we're looking at. And if that makes sense at all.
It does. And Stephanie has a comment that leads us into the next thing we want to address. And her comment speaks specifically to this whole increased independence and stuff. She says it's very hard. Also, my son is 16, was always introverted. Now he has a new girlfriend since February and invited her to the prom. And he wants to go to the after party after the prom, but she doesn't know who'll be there. And her son is very smart. He makes smart choices, but it's not easy on her. This is an example of what you were talking about.
Oh, yeah. So first of all, I'm so happy to hear that she recognizes that her son is smart and makes smart choices. And I think that that's something that speaks volumes about what's a tip for a parent when you're having these life decisions, right? He is doing exactly what he is supposed to do developmentally, right? This is his goal to further independence, right? He's 16. He's in that middle stage and at the later end of the middle stage where he's really starting to try to plan for the future, have his own independent space, to work on himself and develop his self-esteem. One of the things that I would say is, if your son has a history of making smart decisions and and makes smart choices, the best thing that you can do for him is allow him to continue and reinforce those smart decisions and smart choices. The second you start taking away some of his autonomy, that's when we start seeing children or adolescents make bad choices, because you're taking away the thing that they're aiming to go for. So what I would suggest, Stephanie, is at this point in time, be there. Ask him how the party was afterwards, because at the end of the day, you will still be a mother and you're always going to be worried about your child. But what I would say is allow him to make those smart decisions. And if he doesn't make those smart decisions, if he makes a mistake, or maybe he wants to talk to you about maybe some of the bad decisions that he makes, I encourage to open up the door and make space for him to talk to you about these things. The healthier the connection and communication with a parental figure, we see that developmentally that is increasingly better for long-term development, right? We see more individuals start going into higher independent jobs and looking at better social functionings overall, right? They need to experience some of these things on a social level. All you can do right now is let him make the smart decisions, let him make those smart choices, because it'll reinforce him in the future to continue making those smart decisions, smart choices. Sometimes we hinder that process, that developmental process of, oh, well, I don't have a decision. I don't have my autonomy. I have to do what my mother says or my father says. And what that ends up happening is when they get to that stage of the 17 to 21-year-old, or when you're trying to get them out of the house, they're not able to make the decisions on their own because they haven't had that experience. Hope that answers the question.
She says, thank you very much. She says, so should I let him go to the party? Stephanie, that is a decision that you have to make, but you are still the mother of a 16-year-old, and it is okay for you to do what a lot of parents do, no matter what our children tell us, is ask the questions. Whose house? Who's going to be there? How are you going to get there? When should I expect you to return? You can still ask those questions while he's making smart decisions. That's your job. So it doesn't mean that you just step completely away.
Oh, absolutely not.
What does a meaningful relationship look like in general and specifically for our teens?
So in general, a meaningful relationship is one that has active listening on both ends of the spectrum, meaning that as a parent, you're actively listening to what your son or daughter is saying and what they're trying to present. And then on the other side is they're actively listening to you as well. That is a meaningful relationship because it shows that both parties are interested in what the other person is has to say, and also the response. And oftentimes, I think that one of the challenges that we have is we listen to react and not listen to want to understand. And I think this happens a lot on both ends of the spectrum. I think as parents, we might be better able to understand this concept. A developing adolescent may have a little bit of harder time grasping this, but as parents, I always say we are the role models. So we play as a role model towards our children. So when we listen to react, what we've noticed is a lot of adolescents do the same exact thing. They're mimicking that pattern. So if we're not even really listening to what the adolescent is having to say or the teen is having to say, what ends up happening, what message we're relaying to them is we know better, right? We know what you're going to say. We know you. We made you, etc. I know everything you're going to do. I know your next step. But they still have something that's valid in that they want to express. And
Yeah.
even if it's just from an emotional level, that they just want to feel heard, these things are crucial to having a meaningful relationship. And what it does is it actually promotes a deeper and more meaningful relationship when it comes time for them in the later stages of development. They're able to come to you and discuss, maybe more personal and private matters that they would feel comfortable with only a parental figure or a mentor or a peer. So
Well,
that's in general. But I just want to just deal one thing in specific. It also means, and this doesn't just limit it to conversations. It also means physical touch, hugs, kisses. I think that we don't emphasize that enough as a parent. Going to your children and really providing some physical contact, and also time. Just putting away the cell phone, putting it down during the dinner table, not just down on the table, but in the room or in somewhere completely out of sight, out of mind, and spending time with them, quality time with your children is irreplaceable.
you alluded to social changes in
Yeah.
teens. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that affects their relationships?
Yeah, so it's a time management issue. What it boils down
Mhm.
to is, in the early stages of development. So our role models are our parents, and
Mhm.
every child can relate to that. Even as an adult, you can probably think about that and looking back.
Yeah.
But there's a certain point in around that right 10 to 13, a little bit after the 13, where we need to prioritize. And when I say need, it's from a developmental perspective. We need to prioritize some of our peer relationships and social relationships, and there's just not enough time, right? Because if you're spending time with your family, you're spending time with your peers, and you have school and everything else in between, there's oftentimes a scheduling conflict, which is why you always hear after school, it's like, I want to hang out with my friends, and you never let me do this, you never let me do that. And it's challenging because there's a time conflict. If you're somebody who likes to have dinner at 6, and then their friends can only hang out between the hours of 5 to 7, well, all of a sudden you have some of these time crunches that are difficult to squeeze in. One of the
Mhm.
recommendations I give to a lot of parents is try to get a schedule in order, because your teen is oftentimes not trying to be rebellious against the parent. It's just literally they don't have enough time in the day.
Mhm.
And I know that seems like a little bit, what do you mean? They've got plenty of time. Well,
Yeah.
I also will remind you that most teens are not very good at time management. So they might have plenty of time in your world because you get a million things done. Like I always say, I can get a million things done in my day, but like with what a teenager might be going through, they may not have that time. It may be taking them
Mhm.
longer to finish their homework assignments, and they have big projects due, and they're wanting to spend a little bit more time with that friend or
Mhm.
whomever it may be. And so they're trying to manage that time, and it oftentimes plays on that, is that they just don't have great time management skills. And having firm schedules, and I oftentimes recommend parents to like try to create a dinner schedule or something along that line where it's
Mhm.
consistent and continuous. And if they're having a difficult time, like once a week they want to go out, and but the rest of the week they've been perfect, but once a week they want to go and say, hey, mom or dad, can I skip dinner to go hang out with so and so? I oftentimes say, reward the positive behavior instead of emphasizing the negative. So reward them on the fact that they've really done well all week, and they're like, "Wow, you've been to dinner, you've been great," and emphasize that instead of saying, "I really hate it when you don't come to dinner, and it really would upset me that you're not going to be here," because that all that promotes is guilt and shame, and what that may do is encourage them not to come because they're going to be like, "Oh, I get it every time I don't come. They give me a whole spiel about how I don't make it to dinner." So
Yeah.
so obviously structure and schedule helps them because it gives them time management skill, but as well as promoting the positives in their behaviors rather than emphasizing the negatives.
Okay, we're going to talk about soon the what happens when they don't have these, but there are a couple points you made that I want to emphasize, and I
Please.
want to get to Christina's comments. You said reward the positive instead of pointing out the negative. And I don't know about some of the other people who are raising teens out there, but that is really hard for me because it's not that we're into the negative, it's that we want to help you stop the negative
Yeah,
because
right.
then we see the potential, right? If you just didn't do that one thing. So it's not that we think you're awful because you did the one thing. So I'm glad you said that to reinforce it. Reward the positive instead of pointing out the negative.
Right.
Um, and then you also said, listen to want to understand. When you're listening because you want to understand. And I think that's best if I just leave it at that and don't even say the rest, because once the rest comes into your mind, you go off someplace else. And I saved that for last because Christina's comment addresses that. She says she tries to ask, how can I help you? Is it just to listen and allow you to vent, or offer a possible solution?
Mm. So first of all, I like that you're giving options. That's always something that I recommend, and I don't know the age of your son or daughter, but I think that open-ended questions are generally a good way to start. Now, what ends up happening, and I get this a lot, parents come to me and say, "Oh, I asked them an open-ended question, and then you know what they did? They just gave me a very short and non-responsive answer. So I have no answer that was led to my open, that was to my open-ended question." So what I tell them is, well, then start becoming more specific if there's a goal that you have, because
Mhm.
teens are pretty good at picking up. Oh, okay, there. Oh, 13 and
Yeah.
16. Okay, so yeah, so
Yeah.
two different age ranges. So I would actually treat them differently, and because this is why I was talking about different stages of development. So your 13-year-old is definitely going to answer differently than the 16. I think the 16 you could probably ask more open-ended intellectual questions and ask them, well, what do you like? How do you like me to approach you? But the 13-year-old might have a harder time understanding that concept. That's where I would be more along the lines of open-ended, just active listening. I wouldn't try to have him explain his emotional reasoning because there might not be one. With that age range, the 13-year-old, there might not be a reason. They may still be going through hormonal changes, developmental changes,
Mhm.
where they're still trying to understand themselves why they're upset at you, or how you can help, because they may not have that capacity yet. The 16-year-old, they're definitely more physically mature and cognitively developed. They may be able to understand what's going on within themselves, but they may still also be exploring. It's kind of on that bridge. One of the things I would say is allow them time to express themselves, and I always say create a safe space. They may not know now, but they may know in a day or a month from now what's going on. And as long as that safe space exists for them to be able to talk to you, and as you put it, vent out, but just talk to you openly and without feeling like there needs to be barriers or boundaries.
Mhm.
I think that that's helpful for their development, and they'll come around. Just you gotta sometimes give them a little bit of time to warm up, and that's what I tell parents. Sometimes it's just a timing game. We can't force teens to open up, but they will if you have the space there.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
So, in order to emphasize the importance of these meaningful relationships, tell us what can happen if they don't have them. What is it that we're trying to avoid? And then we're going to get to Marcia's comment.
Okay. Well, the overall goal it's twofold. One is
Mhm.
prevention, and then the other one is identification of problems. So prevention looks
Mhm.
more along the lines of prevention of substance abuse, prevention of high risk behaviors, prevention of isolation, behavior patterns that could be, dangerous towards the development of an adolescent.
Mhm.
So if we catch this early enough, or if we see something early enough that, we can redirect it and steer it in the right course. And that's always a good thing, doing it as
Mhm.
early on as possible, where they may not even see that there's any issues, but we can just guide that into the direction. The other part is intervention, and actually going in because there's an actual issue there, whether it be depression, anxiety, to a clinical degree that needs to be addressed, whether it be through pharmaceutical medication or through clinical interventions. There needs to be some form of treatment available for that, and that's where we see that a lot more in the middle to late stages, where there are just issues that are playing themselves out, and the earlier we can intervene, the more likely it is that it doesn't become compounded with other issues combined. So it doesn't become a co-occurring issue. It just, we can address the anxiety only, and it didn't become anxiety with substance use and isolation, right?
Okay.
That's the goals early on. And had a comment.
We have, and I said Marcia before, I'm not sure, it could be Marcia. So either way, I apologize. I got it wrong. I'm 50% right, 50% wrong. How can you plan ahead to have open communications? I'm still in the tween years, but want to start that open dialogue. Do you have any tips?
Yes, I got a few. So first and foremost, I talked about physical touch and emotional support. So that's a big one. Physical touch does a lot more, especially you're talking about the tween years. I know that kids always try to push away from the hugs and the kisses. Mom, you're embarrassing me. Okay, but keep doing it. Not in a forceful fashion, but keep doing it, even if it's in private. They the older they get, and studies have actually shown this, that physical touch is helpful towards the overall development of an adolescent. So sometimes it's even just being able to put your hand on their shoulders, or just being present and knowing that you're there. So that's a physiological way. Obviously, getting into the early habits of turning off electronic devices. Um, that the earlier you can start that, the better off it's going to be in the long term, because they'll be in a form of habit. When you're listening, listen calmly, be mindful of your tones. If ever, there's disagreements between you and your spouse or partner, try to make that more private. I always talk about bedroom talk versus living room talk. There's a big difference. There are conversations that may need to be had. Sometimes I say that's conversations for the bedroom and not for the living room. Be mindful of that, because children, they hear that, they process that, and they may not be involved in the conversation, but they're definitely listening. And sometimes that makes a bigger impact on them than we know. Um, when you're talking to them, when you're listening to them, give them your undivided attention. In the car, when you're driving them from school or on the way home. Even though I know some people like to blast the radio, listen to some music, have some fun, but that could be a crucial time for you to just connect and communicate. So I have the habit of leaving my radio off, and just not letting conversation happen. Don't force it, but if it's silent, all of a sudden they just want to talk about something. At least I created a space that they can.
Mhm.
And then the other thing is just encourage them to talk about their emotions, not shutting them down or shutting out emotions. I think that sometimes we do the not now. We'll talk about it later. That's to me, there's nothing more important than what my children are experiencing and feeling. So I would automatically go into if they're in the middle of an event, and they want to speak about something that they're feeling, just step aside for a few minutes, give them your undivided attention. It will mean the world to them, but more importantly, they'll feel more comfortable in coming to you the next time this comes up.
Okay. And if you have someone who insists on having music in the car, a tip is you can use the music as a conversation starter.
Yeah.
Either asking them, "Who is this? What is this song? Da 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 da. What do you like about them?" Without making an interrogation, or as I've said, "This is a great song. Although women really shouldn't be talking about themselves that way, but it has a good beat." And then you can talk about, yeah, you're right. The topic
Yeah.
is not so you can move on. Um, We're coming to the end of our time together, but I don't want to wrap up before you give us some helpful resources for people who want to dig a little deeper, dive deeper into the topic.
So there's some literature that I always recommend to parents in general. When it comes to communication, I think the Language of Love by Gary Smalley and Dr. Trent is very helpful in understanding a concept called word pictures. It's I can't go into detail. I probably could have another half an hour lecture on just that, but we oftentimes communicate in what I call non-effective fashion, especially when we're talking about adolescence, because we're using words, and sometimes the words don't resonate as well. Word pictures and trying to go into narrative style conversations, which is giving them more story-based understanding and really painting a picture in their minds versus trying to articulate very specific and concrete sentences. It sometimes is much more impactful, and you can see that their understanding of what you're talking about is better. Like you mentioned music, but there are many different ways of sharing an idea with a person that can be helpful. And definitely looking into different, I always say there's different literatures for self-help and reminding yourself that a lot of the things that happen, it's not personally against you as a parent. I think everybody takes things personally, like, oh, it's my fault, I did this. No, I think that's possibly one of the biggest things I will say as an advice to any parent is really, remind yourself that this isn't personal, that whatever they're saying is not against you. There's a very great book by Don Ruiz called The Four Agreements, which talk about not taking things personally. I think he describes it well, and even with your kids, so taking that same concept and applying it to your teenagers, really just understand that most of it's what they're experiencing, and they're just projecting it, they're mirroring it onto you, because that and I take it as a compliment. Sometimes when that happens, I'm like, it's like they came to come and mirror that to me. That's right. I'd rather that than maybe them mirroring it onto a negative influence. At least I know that, if they're coming to me and they're presenting this emotional struggle that they're going through, and they're shouting and yelling, I remember that they're doing that with me. They're not doing it to me.
That's a great perspective. It's a compliment if they feel free enough to do that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's where, don't take it personally. Really allow yourself to understand that this isn't about you. I know we like to make things about us, but this is sometimes just about their stage of development and where they're at. And they're trying to create a meaningful relationship in the way that they know how. Remember that they're not maybe developmentally at that stage where they can, and they're still trying to balance everything out.
That is very helpful, and it's a great place to end. Stephanie says thank you to you both. Thank you, Stephanie, and everybody who's watching this. We appreciate you taking time and spending a half hour with us. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today. This is valuable advice, as I see a bunch of thank yous clicking in our comment section. I want to remind everyone that tomorrow, same time, 10:30 a.m. Eastern time, on our various social media platforms, you will find Coffee with Jen and Sharon, where they will break down some topic having to do with parenting or teens, or maybe something else that they just feel like talking about. They're a lot of fun, and you should join them tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Again, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you everybody else for joining us.
Bye.